Hey, everybody out there. I know it's the top of the hour. We're going to give just a few minutes for our kind of a quorum to show up. So, all right, we've got Mike Baca from Kalamazoo. Tori, hey, how's everybody doing out there? Yeah, go ahead and throw in the chat if you can find your way to the chat. Let us know where you're coming in from. I'm coming in from outside Nashville, Tennessee. Got people from California, Rochester, New York. Very cool. And Kyle, I know you're a world traveler. Where are you right now?
I'm in Atlanta, so yeah, I'm home base currently.
That's great. All right, kind of rearrange my screen just a little bit. We had just a few internet bandwidth things going on, so we may not show our screen throughout the whole presentation, but we can talk about that in just a minute. We'll see what happens here, but we'll give it just another minute so that everybody gets in. Looks like the numbers are continuing to pile up, and comments are piling in. Connecticut, California, Ireland. All right, we've got. I missed Austria and Norway. So yeah, who's the first one from overseas? Let's see here. Looks like maybe France. Was that Eater? Fantastic. Welcome, Ray. Welcome, Lassie from Denmark. Stefan from Switzerland. I always hope that I get these names correctly. My mom tells me that I don't say my name correctly, so my goal is always to pronounce somebody's name correctly. So forgive me if I mess that up as we go on through here. All right, we're a minute in, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Integrating Risk Management and CAPA, How to Supercharge Your Medical Device Quality. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm your moderator for today's session. I am a medical device guru and the head of industry insights and education at Greenlight Guru. At Greenlight Guru, our mission is to improve the quality of life. Through our work in the MedTech industry, likely a shared goal of many of you here who are here today, we host these free webinars to share valuable insights, learn from top industry experts, and to showcase our industry-leading solutions. So our software is designed to help MedTech companies bring life-changing products to patients faster, more efficiently, and with less risk. Our MedTech suite includes software solutions for product development, quality management, and clinical data management, all tailored specifically for the medical device industry. So if you're interested in learning why over 1,000 leading medtech companies trust Greenlight Guru, feel free to visit www.greenlight.guru for your personalized demo today after today's webinar. Now, just a few housekeeping items before we dive into today's presentation. First, we invite you to actively participate. So a lot of you have already found the chat panel there, so feel free to use that on the right to connect with fellow attendees and to make comments as we go along. Make sure that you play nicely though. The Q&A tab though, that's also up there at the top right. That's specifically to ask questions that we will ask the presenter during the Q&A session later. So you can also upvote, thumbs up those questions. So maybe you personally don't have a question you want to ask, go ahead and check out the Q&A section anyway, and then upvote those questions that are going to be most relevant to you so that we make sure we're asking the questions that matter the most. So I'll try to keep track of the chat, but if there are questions in there, they may get missed. Definitely use that Q&A for the questions you want us to ask Kyle. Second, we will be sending out the full recording and presentation slides to all registrants after the live event, so watch your inbox for that follow-up email. That will be coming in the later days, either later next week or later this week or early next week, so keep an eye out for that. We will be sharing all of the slides, so I know that's always a question that we get, so happy to do that for you all. Good to see everybody from that are still coming in. North Carolina, our hearts are with you. Liverpool, Serbia, Finland, welcome everybody. Let's go ahead and get started though. Kyle Rose, I'd like to introduce you to Kyle. He's a medical device expert specializing in development of efficient quality systems for startups to large medical device companies. As CEO of Rook Quality Systems, Kyle works as a quality manager and advisor for over 100 medical device companies, overseeing overall quality strategy and ensuring compliance through quality engineering support and auditing services. Kyle's a certified quality auditor and has regulatory and audit experience for a variety of markets, including the FDA, CE marking, and MDSAP and other markets. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you, Kyle, for today's feature presentation.
Awesome. Thanks, Etienne, and thanks, Greenlight, for hosting this webinar today. Very excited to talk with everyone. As we mentioned at the start, having a little bit bandwidth issues, so going to turn my camera off for this. But looking forward to talking more about the CAPA and risk management process and how they tie together. So a little bit high level on Rook Quality Systems for those who have not seen one of our webinars before or haven't worked with us. We are a consulting firm. I'm based in Atlanta. We have a lot of our support here. We also have a branch in Taiwan and a branch in Europe. We support all types of medical device companies with the development and maintenance of quality systems. We provide hands-on support for design, risk documentation, software documentation, and cybersecurity. We provide support for regulatory submissions, so both U.S. and international regulatory submissions. And we also do a good bit of quality system training. We're very excited to partner with Greenlight for these types of events. We think it's very important to get as much knowledge as we can shared with the industry and ecosystem to make sure that even if you're not directly a Rook client, you still have actionable information you can use to improve your quality system, improve your device, make sure we're putting safe and effective medical devices on the market. Here's just kind of an overview of some of the clients we work with. Again, a big presence in the US. We also have a lot of international clients as well. We have a lot of international clients trying to get into the US for the first time. Our team currently, we have over 35 consultants. We have 13 certified auditors, including former FDA and notified body auditors working for BSI and other large notified bodies. We conduct a lot of internal audits and mock audits for our clients, and we also help companies when they're going through their audits. We also can support if you're going through your first ISO or FDA audit and you're a little nervous, which happens a lot. We can have people from our team supporting you during that process as well. Also founded in 2012, so we're going on 12 years now of doing quality system consulting and med device quality for all types of companies. Also celebrating, I think, 9 years partnership with Greenlight. So very excited to continue to work with Greenlight and work with all the great products they present for the MedTech market. A little bit of an outline on what we're talking about today. So today's topic is, combining risk and CAPAs and how they work together. So going to do a little touch on just the CAPA process, as well as a touch on the risk management process, and then how they fit together. So there's a few different ways that they work together, both if you're writing a CAPA, how you can incorporate risk. If you're updating risk, how you can incorporate CAPAs. So kind of touch on both those scenarios and also share some industry case studies that we've worked on where risk and CAPAs were used together to have the best compliance output. We'll talk a good bit about specific examples and how to improve both your CAPA and your risk management process and how to make sure they're working together efficiently and effectively. So I think this is kind of just the intro, but really wanted to talk about, my opinion on CAPA and risk. So I think, based on my experience, and I've helped, like I said, hundreds of med device companies, been through hundreds of audits, CAPAs and risk analysis are two of the most important QMS activities, and I might even argue the most important activities for your device and your quality system. CAPA is the key indicator of QMS success. If I was going to look at one thing and try to judge how well a quality system is going, it would be their CAPA process. CAPAs are the backbone of the quality system and the first indicator of a successful quality system. They touch all aspects of the device and compliance. And if you have a highly functional CAPA system, then you're going to have a highly functional QMS. The CAPA system often gets confused if companies are opening too many CAPAs or companies are scared to open CAPAs, but I really think the CAPA process is very beneficial for the quality system and leads to proactively finding issues and fixing them in a very well documented process to ensure that the corrective action or preventive action was effective and it actually meets whatever the issue was. So identify the root cause and you've implemented a correct action. This is, often mirrored in the fact that when you go to any ISO or FDA audit, the first thing they look at is your CAPA process. So the FDA QSIP model is really focused on CAPAs as one of the main areas of focus for the FDA audit. And then similar with your ISO audits, whenever you start an ISO audit, their first thing they're going to look at is any previous CAPAs from the previous audit. So I think that focus, both by the auditors and from our experience, really indicates how important the CAPA process is for your quality system. And similar, risk analysis is the key indicator of device success. We all know that the design and development of the device is critical, but without a proper risk analysis, it's really hard to show that your device is safe and effective without addressing all the risks related to your device. So again, similar to how CAPA is key and essential to the functioning and success of your quality system, risk analysis is just as important for the device success. If you have a successful risk analysis program during development, you'll have less issues during testing and less issues once you release the product initially to market. Same if you're ongoing updating and reviewing your risk analysis, including your post-market surveillance, then there's a much higher probability that you're going to have success with your device going forward. So I'm very excited to talk more about both of these areas. These are both things that I think we really focus on with our clients, and we do a really good job of training and implementing with our training sessions and our clients in our QMS setup to make sure that these are key areas of focus for your quality system, your device success. All right, now let's dive a little bit more into the actual basics of the CAPA system. So for those of you who are new, CAPA is an abbreviation for, or acronym for, corrective and preventive action. So there's a lot of acronyms in med device quality systems, but this is one that gets used quite a bit. Corrective action being something that you're fixing that has an issue or a nonconformance tied to it, and then preventive action being more of a preventive tool to look in your system, look at your design, look at your process, and see if there are potential nonconformances that you can prevent with the use of this CAPA process. So the purpose of the CAPA at a high level is to collect information, analyze it, identify any issues related to product or quality, and then take appropriate actions, corrective and or preventive, to prevent their reoccurrence. This is the definition from the FDA. And then on the importance, it's really critical that verifying and validating this CAPA and implementing all these actions will move to making a better process, a better quality system, a better device going forward, helping to reduce, prevent, or minimize device failures once you've effectively implemented this CAPA process. So high level, it's a detailed process to break down any issues or any potential issues, fix them, and then also prevent them from happening in the future. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the actual process of creating and writing a CAPA. These are some of the key uses of CAPA. So identify and address the root causes of any product or compliance issues, prevent reoccurrence of nonconformances by implementing corrective actions, proactively prevent potential issues. So this is more on the preventive action side, ensure compliance with regulatory standards and improve product safety, and then drive continuous improvement through data-based decisions, right? So analyzing data in your CAPAs or from other data analysis methods to ensure that you are implementing CAPAs and they are successful. The key part of having accessible CAPA is the last stage, which is going back and verifying that the CAPA is actually effective, right? So within the process of a CAPA, there's different phases that identify what needs to be done and what needs to be done at each stage. The first one with the CAPA process is just the identification of the issue. Do we need to open a CAPA? How, what's been affected? What has happened? And should this CAPA process be started? CAPAs can arise from multiple different things, but they can include a lot of areas of the quality system as well. So a lot of times we see CAPAs arise from complaints or nonconformances. Also, potential design changes are areas that you could have an issue and then want to open a CAPA to address that. Nonconformances can be anything from nonconformances from an audit, so quality and regulatory nonconformances, also be from nonconformances with a product. There is a process that nonconformances should be used first, right? So within the FDA and the ISO standards, it outlines a process of a nonconformance, and then the next level of severity and documentation would be a CAPA. So you don't want to go overkill and open a CAPA for every failure device or every typo you find in your quality system. That process should be better captured in a nonconformance. But if there's a trend of nonconformances or more severe nonconformances, you can tie that nonconformance into your CAPA and use the CAPA process to be a deeper dive and include all these additional steps to make sure that you've implemented a new process, identified the root cause, and fix it going forward. With Greenlight Guru and their CAPA and nonconformance modules, you're able to link these together. So if you do have a complaint in Greenlight, you can also link that to a CAPA. If you have a nonconformance in Greenlight, you can link that to a CAPA as well. So just because you open a nonconformance or open a complaint doesn't necessarily mean you don't still need a CAPA. You can also bundle complaints, bundle nonconformances into one CAPA and use that as the master record of going through and fixing this issue. With the impact. So you identify early in the CAPA process what the impact of this CAPA might be. So identify what products are impacted, what processes, what systems, potentially what employees, what training might be impacted. So that's really one of the first things to do in the CAPA. That ties directly to the risk level of this CAPA. So again, connecting risk and CAPAs together, we want to identify what the risk level is for the CAPA. Typically, you want to do an early risk assessment. As you learn more information, you might be able to go back and adjust either higher or lower the risk level for the CAPA. There's different ways to do this. You can do this with a risk analysis method, such as like a scoring method. We also typically use just high, medium, and low risk levels and define that in our CAPA procedure and use that as the risk level determination for the CAPA. Within the CAPA process, there is the containment action as well and correction. So in this scope, if you have a procedure that wasn't updated to a standard, say you updated your QMS to EU MDR, but you forgot to update your complaint procedure. So you would identify first within correction that we need to fix that procedure, and then we're going to go and look and see if there's other procedures affected as well. So that's more the corrective action. So this number 4 and number 6, I think, are things that can get confused, and it's not super well defined specifically in ISO 1345 2016. But if you're referencing ISO 9001, they call out in more detail the correction process. And we've seen a lot of auditors want companies to have both the correction and the corrective action clearly defined as separate actions within this full CAPA record. So once the correction has been identified, this is also something that can be related to product, right? So if you identify that some products were labeled incorrectly, we want to go and fix those labels, right? Whether that's replacing the labels or whatever it might be, that's a correction. And the corrective action would be identifying why they were printed improperly. Was it the wrong file? Was it the printer issue? Whatever happened, that's more on the corrective side. And then thanks, Mark, it is, like I said, captured in ISO 9001, really this correction side. The next kind of phase that aligns with this early planning in the CAPA is the investigation and root cause analysis. So root cause analysis is really a deep dive into why this CAPA happened and using different methods to investigate in a detailed fashion, especially with manufacturing or more complex issues. The root cause might not be easy to find when you go through the first review, right? You'll go back and review your batch records, review materials you used in this manufacturing process, review equipment, review training records. all these things could potentially lead to this failure, you need to dive into each one and identify what the root cause is. There's different methods of doing a root cause analysis, 5 whys, fault tree analysis, Ishikawa diagrams or the fishbone diagrams. All of these things are great tools and can be used depending on what type of CAPA it is, what the issue is, how many different factors and variables are involved with that root cause analysis. It is important that you document how you completed the root cause analysis and include that in your CAPA record. Corrective action, so that would be kind of the next step. So we've identified the root cause, we've identified the correction. The next step is to not only address the initial correction, but address the root cause to prevent this from happening with other software tool or other areas in the company, right? So if you identify that there was a issue with one of your software tools not being properly validated, then you can fix that one tool, but you also need to look at the rest of your tools and see if they need to be validated. You also need to look at your validation process and evaluation that allow this initial software tool to get into this quality system but not be validated. So that's the corrective action, not just addressing this one thing that's in the CAPA, but also looking at your broader processes, broader design, broader SOPs to make sure that this can be fixed for everything else. Regarding the question about ISO and FDA aligning, they are as part of the QMSR. I think we've done some podcasts and webinars on that topic as well. So lots of content related to the QMSR and what's happening with that new process in the next few years. Once we've identified the corrective action, we have to actually go in and implement this corrective action. So lots of ways to implement that. It really depends on what your root cause and what your corrective action are. It could be as simple as updating procedures. It could involve training. It could involve design changes, new equipment, new suppliers. All of these things can be part of your implementation process. It is important that you review the root cause process and then make sure that your implementation meets both the correction and the corrective action. And then I think one of the key areas of CAPA and the reason that makes it so critical for your quality system is really this verification of effectiveness. So we've done all this work, we've identified the root cause, implemented corrective actions, trained our new employees. Did it work, right? So we go back, we typically give ourselves a few weeks or months, depending on how much data we need. And we go back and say, hey, we updated this manufacturing process, got a new piece of equipment in, trained our operators. Let's see if we're not having these failures anymore, right? So that is the verification of effectiveness process to ensure that your CAPA worked. Most of the time it does work, but there's also instances where the verification of effectiveness identifies that the CAPA didn't fix what we wanted it to fix, and we need to go back to step one and identify other root causes that might be contributing to this issue, right? So this loop of verification of effectiveness is critical to showing that the things you've implemented, the steps you've done, make sure that this CAPA is effective and has addressed the issue. Once we've gotten the checkbox and we've closed off the effectiveness check, then we can go to closure and move forward with the CAPA. So this process is very detailed, but I think it's very detailed for a reason, because it shows the correct steps to make sure that we identify the issue, close it, implement our actions, and then verify it works. Just kind of circling back to the previous slide. So we identified kind of the key stages. These are how we actually implement them in our CAPA action process. So identify and address the root cause. So we need to conduct a root cause analysis and then clearly document in our CAPA record the methods and results of the root cause. We have seen processes with companies, and especially larger companies and more complicated manufacturing or processes, that they try to go and fix the easiest thing to fix first and see if that addresses it, rather than going into the hardest thing first, right? So using a risk-based approach with your root cause analysis to say, hey, we could create a whole new manufacturing line, or we could update this SOP and change it, and that'll take 2 weeks rather than 6 months, right? So a lot of times you can look at this root cause analysis and identify the easiest path that might improve it and see if you can use that one first rather than the more complicated path. But if that easiest path doesn't work, then you have to go back and reassess. The idea of preventing reoccurrences is covered with the effectiveness verification. So you want to make sure that any of these implementations from your CAPA, including updating SOPs, design changes, training, are all implemented. People are trained on them. With the preventive actions, so using CAPAs to look at the QMS and product to prevent nonconformances. So this involves having a very detailed understanding of your process and your quality system to identify, hey, there might be an issue in this process that we caught with something else. Let's open a CAPA to see if we can prevent anything down the road. CAPAs can also be used to drive updates to standards or new regulations. So covering what was brought up earlier in the chat, FDA is aligning with 1345. This QMSR regulation is going to have updates to your quality system, your records, your DMRs, now your MDF, things like that, right? So you can use a CAPA to be the umbrella that captures all of these changes and show with your internal audit that you've updated your quality system, you conducted a verification check with your internal audit to QMSR, and now you meet the new regulations. So more of a preventive action to show, hey, we know these regulations are coming. Let's put a CAPA around this process to show how we're going to update our procedures, update our training, and then do an internal audit to the new regulations to show we're compliant. It can also be used to drive continuous improvement, right? So reviewing trends in nonconformances, complaints, product realization to identify if CAPAs are needed. Product realization being around your failure rates for manufacturing, incoming inspection, all those things, analyzing those within the scope of your QMS processes, your management review, any of your internal meetings is very beneficial. And those trends can then lead to CAPAs if we notify trends in failure rates, complaint increases, NCR increases, things like that. Just diving into from the regulation, so specifically what they're calling out in 21 CFR. So make sure that you have a process in place for CAPAs, so having your high-level SOPs in place, outlining the process that is covered by the CAPAs, so any of these areas, reports, audit reports, records, service records, complaints, return product, all of these areas should feed into the CAPA. Investigating the cause of nonconformities related to product, process, and quality system. Identifying actions needed to correct and prevent reoccurrence, and then verifying or validating the corrective and preventive action, and then implementing these changes to make sure it doesn't happen in the future, right? So going through and updating your internal procedures, updating your training records, making sure that whatever is implemented from the CAPA actually gets completed with your change order, your change request, whatever it might be, to make sure these new changes are implemented. Each manufacturer shall maintain this process, ensuring that it is communicated to those directly responsible for this. So if you are updating this, that's why the training part is so critical, and make sure you're communicating these CAPAs to the people actually doing the work, right? And then submitting all this information for management review. So also making sure that you have a thorough review of your CAPA process during your management review. So this is one of the direct inputs, outputs that are listed in ISO. So make sure that you have this captured in your management review, and you're reviewing closed CAPAs, reviewing open CAPAs, and also reviewing your CAPA timelines, right? So making sure that you're reviewing any data around how long it's taking you to close CAPAs, all of that information should be reviewed in your management review as well. And then just highlighting that this is a main area of focus during the FDA and ISO audit. It's critical you maintain an effective CAPA system. Saw a few notes in the chat around like how long can you keep a CAPA open? Can you open more than one CAPA? for the same issue year after year. So, that's really, there's no set answer in how long you can keep a CAPA open. If you have had a CAPA open for, a few months, you need to continually update that CAPA record with the information as to the status of the CAPA. You don't want an auditor to show up and say, "We opened this CAPA last year and you haven't made any notes, so we don't know what's going on. It looks like you just ignored it," right? So you should be going in and adding notes as to the status of the CAPA. Some CAPAs around design change or manufacturing change or new validation can take 6 months to a year, which is fine because that's how long the process takes, but you need to update the CAPA record during this process. All of these results should be documented. And like I said, if you have a CAPA or you've opened a CAPA year after year, you need to update and address that in the CAPA record while you're opening in the same issue again in a new CAPA. And as long as you properly address that information in this CAPA record, there shouldn't be an audit finding. You just need to make sure you've captured it in this CAPA. The worst thing that can happen is you show this to an auditor and you don't have any updates or justification as to why it's still open. That raises more issues with an audit review. All right, so that's kind of going into CAPAs. Now we're going to talk a little bit about risk management and the overview process. So just basics on risk management. So this is the process of identifying the occurrence of harm and severity related to your medical device. It's a systematic approach to reviewing both the design, but also your procedures and practices, and then monitoring this risk. The evaluation of it should be related to scientific knowledge on this type of device based on external areas of information, such as MOD database, UTMed, things like that, as well as identifying the level of effort related to the risk management process is commensurate with the level of risk for your product. So you can use risk to also put structure around your quality system, around your testing. So using risk, if you have a class 1 device, it's a lower risk product. The amount of testing and detail around that product might not be at the same level of a class 3 product, right? And that's why, if you do a submission for a class 3, there's much more information required to the FDA than a class 1, just based on the risk of the product. So that same approach can be used for your quality system, can be used for your records within your quality system, your testing activities. Risk can be used for that approach as well. There is a specific standard, 14971, that outlines risk management for medical device quality systems. So this is very useful. Similar to CAPA, it's a big focus during audits. So it's critical that you have this information captured in your quality system, but that you also have an implemented process and that it's aligned with the latest requirements for 14971, as well as any other updates to ISO, QMSR, things like that as well. Specifically from 14971, manufacturers must maintain processes for identifying hazards and hazard situations, estimating, evaluating risks, controlling these risks, and monitoring the effectiveness of the risk control. So similar to the effectiveness check in a CAPA, you need to make sure you're monitoring your risks and then also the controls in place, whether that is testing, post-market activities, labeling. All of these things are considered risk controls that you can use to make sure that the risk of your product is maintaining within the level that is appropriate for your product. The risk process shall continue throughout the life cycle of the device. So this is another thing that's critical, is that risk analysis is not just do it once during design and we don't address it ever again. Risk analysis is an ongoing process. The risk analysis of what are the risks, hazard, foreseeable events, hazard situations, the evaluation, so how are we scoring these things as far as severity and probability, and then the controls. All of these things should be updated and reviewed continuously. So whether you have set times to review this or it happens organically through complaints and CAPAs and nonconformances, it's critical that you maintain these processes throughout the life cycle of the device and continue to update your risk information. Using post-market data is also critical for having an effective risk management process as well. With the evaluation of risk, so we're going to make sure that we evaluate what the risk is, what the severity and harm is for this risk, and then go from there. The CAPA ties closely to this with how the risk analysis is done. So risk analysis of the CAPA, but also risk estimates for your high-level risk analysis of your design of your device. If the CAPA issue does not appear in the risk analysis, then a new issue should be documented and reviewed, and this should be added to your risk assessment. So in the instance of you receive a new complaint and you've had this trend of complaints or nonconformances, and you're going through the process of your CAPA to identify what the root cause is, how do we fix it, you need to look back at your risk management file and your risk documentation to make sure that this new issue is captured in your risk. This is one thing that we see a lot with people that are putting their device on the market for the first time, is that once you get your device on the market, no matter how much testing you've done internally, external testing, clinical trials, there's always going to be new risks that come up from new users using your product. So when you get this feedback, whether that's through a complaint, just general customer feedback, returns, or potentially adverse events, you need to make sure that this information that might be in a CAPA, might be in a nonconformance, might be in a complaint, is then addressed and put back into your risk management process. Even if you have a risk already defined, it might be that you need to address the probability as well, right? So if you initially estimated a probability and then you start to see that this probability is higher once you actually start selling the device, you need to go back and revise your risk management file, update the probability, and then see, based on this new probability, do we need more controls around this area to make sure that this doesn't happen as frequently? Or do we need more controls because now we've moved into a higher risk classification based on this higher probability? So all of that stuff linked from your CAPAs back to your risk should be captured and reviewed ongoing. The importance of a risk assessment. So like I said at the start, it really is one of the most critical processes for quality system and design of your device, as well as the ongoing manufacturing and life cycle of your product. So this includes hardware, software, whatever it is, you're going to get feedback, you're going to get issues. You should be updating this risk process and evaluating this continuously. Risk assessments help prioritize CAPAs by making sure the most critical aspects get happen first. We also tie this to timelines in our SOPs. So when you're going through the CAPA process and identifying the risk of the CAPA, we have tighter timelines for high risk CAPAs, right? So if there's a complaint that leads to a CAPA that is related to patient safety and potentially adverse events or MDR filings, then that CAPA should be your top priority, right? You might have some other CAPAs that were open a few months ago related to, updates to standards or an audit finding that's a low risk CAPA. Once this new high risk CAPA comes in, that should be your top priority, right? So it's not just identifying the risk of the CAPA. These risks should also be tied to timelines and effort within your team to make sure that you're addressing these higher risk CAPAs and issues as quickly as possible. Benefits of risk just in general with quality system helps identify hazards before they become nonconformities. So really going through your process, and I've seen a few people mention FMEAs on the chat. So using different methods of risk analysis, FMEA is one that we use as well. So a design FMEA will look at your design and your materials, see if there's any potential risks with those. Process FMEA, looking at your process, say, hey, what's the risk of this step in our assembly or this step in our sales order and purchasing process? So looking at all those processes and identifying risk can help reduce nonconformances, help reduce complaints, and then therefore help reduce CAPAs as well. And then ongoing continuous monitoring and prioritization, also critical for risk management, and allow us to tie that closely with the CAPA actions and make sure that both risk and CAPA are effective and maintain control over these processes and control over our quality system and our device going forward. Tying into, specifically how do we conduct risk analysis and how that ties to different processes related to the product and your internal processes. So start by identifying potential hazards associated with the product, the manufacturing process, or the quality process. Evaluate the risk of these things. So like I said, it can be specifically around your manufacturing. It can also include onboarding of employees or purchasing and receiving materials. All these things can have risk analysis tied to them as well. So looking at all of these, evaluating the risks, and then identifying what controls you have in place. Some of the controls can be as easy as training, writing SOPs, ensuring you have software tools, right? So that's one of the big things with Greenlight Guru is they have controls built in. So you can't have a change order that gets approved with not anybody else approving it, right? You can't use old versions of documents that were previously published because Greenlight automatically puts the latest version as the one you can find, right? So these things are already built into the software, and you should analyze these related to your quality system as well. And then linking them back to CAPAs, right? So if there are issues, you can use your CAPA process to effectively fix these issues and make sure you prevent future reoccurrences. After CAPAs are implemented, you can reassess the risk to verify that, hey, we did implement this new control, this new validated process. So conversely, what we talked about earlier, if we've gone from a manual manufacturing process to an automated, our probability of failure should decrease, right? Because we validated our process. You can also use CAPAs and these actions to reduce risk, right? To say, hey, we had a PFMEA, we had higher failure rates, we validated our process, put in better QC. Now our probability of failures has reduced, and so we might not need as many controls or checks because we have a validated process. So this CAPA and risk process works both ways, right? It can identify issues and increase risk, but it also can be proactive and reduce risk related to processes and other aspects of your quality system. How they fit together. All right. So talked a lot about this already. So benefits of linking the two. So identifying a risk-based approach in general helps prevent failures, and CAPAs ensure that actions are taken to correct them and that these actions are implemented and verified that they work. This feedback loop is critical for identifying things from your CAPA process and then using those in the risk management to uncover risks that we didn't know or anticipated risks that we need to have controls around and have these documented. Both of these are necessary for regulatory compliance. This is, again, one of the biggest aspects of your audit, and all auditors will do a deep dive. They will review multiple CAPA records. They typically sample from previous years. So if you have an audit in November, they're going to pull any open CAPAs from 2024. They're going to pull sampling of CAPAs from 2023 and 2022 to make sure that your CAPA process is effective. You're closing your CAPAs out in time that's aligned with your SOPs, and you're doing the proper effectiveness verification to make sure the CAPA process is implemented and these things are verified as effective. Leveraging CAPA data for risk management, so trend analysis, so identifying what trends are happening and how it relates to risk management, both higher or lower, depending on what the trends are. Root cause can be linked to risk, right? So identifying in your root cause process what areas and what risk controls might be needed and how it links back to your root cause analysis. And then improving your risk analysis records, right? So feeding CAPA data into your FMEAs to adjust or enhance risk rankings based on real-world performance. So a lot of times when you're doing your FMEAs for the first time, you're using estimates. You could be using data based on a previous product or a previous manufacturing process. But using and reviewing this information once you have your product on the market and you're getting real world data is critical for the ongoing activities of risk management, as we mentioned earlier. It's throughout the full life cycle of your device, not just a one-time action for your medical device product. How to integrate risk into your CAPAs and QMS. So establish clear objectives. So define the goal of reducing risk and improving quality, ensure that CAPAs and risk teams understand how their efforts contribute to compliance and product safety. So depending on how big your company is, identifying who's involved and how they're going to work together to track this information. Synchronizing data flow, so implementing tools to make sure that you're analyzing data both from CAPA and risk inputs, and ensuring that both teams have access to this information. Another, shout out for Greenlight is their analytics module has a lot of this information and it populates it for you automatically. So using that information and feeding that into your CAPA and risk, incorporating risk into your root cause, your identification of risk and overall risk management strategy, monitor and reassess. So it's an ongoing process to review both CAPAs and risks and analyze findings. So similar, if you have a lot of CAPAs and you do a risk analysis of the CAPA process, you can identify gaps or issues with your risk, your CAPA process. And then utilizing technology. So again, using QMS platforms with built-in CAPA and risk management modules. So again, Greenlight has a risk and CAPA module, and they link together, and you can assign and link these things. So if in your CAPA record, you updated a risk file or you updated a specific severity or probability, then you can have all that linked easily in your CAPA record and risk record. So there's a lot of tools that do a really good job of this. Greenlight specifically does a great job. So using these tools to make sure you are capturing everything and linking it together and presenting this in a record that an auditor can understand. Best practices for managing risks. So implement CAPA process that actually seek out not just nonconformances, but the broader risks associated with it. So for a device, assess the broader process, design, and or supplier risks that might have contributed to it. Prioritize preventive actions. So look at your risk assessment to see which areas of your device have high risk, whether that's on the material side or the use side, and then potentially open preventive actions to prevent any defects, any future issues down the road. I know in some cases, I think Canada at one point had wanted you to do at least one preventive action a year. I don't know if that's still the case, but it really is important. And I would recommend that to everyone to have ongoing preventive actions and make sure that's a priority to do these preventive actions. Track your risk mitigation efforts. So establish KPIs to track the success of this risk mitigation, such as time to close, reoccurrence rate, and risk severity reduction. Heat maps, great way to do this as well. And then maintain comprehensive documentation. I think, just to reiterate this, that this is a very detailed process, and these CAPA records can balloon into a lot of different records, a lot of different updates, a lot of linked documents, reference change orders, updated SOPs, updated design changes, engineering changes. All of these things can be part of a big umbrella CAPA, but making sure you have all this linked and captured is critical for compliance and for your audit success. A few case studies on how we've seen risk and CAPAs work together with some of our clients. So first one is a medical device company identifies a defect during manufacturing, and that defect could potentially have been involved with devices that had already been shipped. So A CAPA was opened to determine the root cause, correction scope, and remediation activities tied to this issue. So it was identified that there was a problem in the work in process manufacturing steps that was not aligned with the SOP or very well defined in the SOP, and various operators were conducting this in different ways. Once we went through the investigation, we identified that the final QC was finding out which ones were failing. So there was no need for a recall. So all of the final QC had identified the ones that did fail, and those were put in quarantine. The risk analysis of the CAPA identified that the risk could be lowered because we were guaranteed that no failed product had left the facility and had not reached any of the end users. New SOPs were created to fix the work in process failure, as well as QC steps to identify any failures at this stage before it went through additional assembly. And then, so that's the correction. The corrective action was to look at similar processes that had work in progress that were potentially complicated steps, identify if there are any gaps there to prevent any future NCs. At the end, in the effectiveness verification check, QC rates improved and there was no recall needed. So great success. Initially, company was very worried, but there was no formal recall needed and an improved process going forward. Case study number 2. So a medical device company identified that incoming inspection criteria cannot be identified using traditional methods. So a medical device company was using a design FMEA to identify the risk levels of each component and then tying their incoming inspection controls to the risk level for each component. So this one had a clear plastic that was being used that was supposed to shield light and protect the device. So they had put in this as a lower risk that didn't need a ton of incoming inspection because they assumed the operators doing inspection would be able to identify, good versus bad. Once they started to receive the product, they realized that the color of the plastic didn't necessarily align with the requirements and light blocking properties just based on color. So they were unable to verify if the plastic met their specifications just by visual inspection and needed additional testing methods to ensure the light blocking properties of the plastic met the product spec. So a CAPA was open to identify correctives, so we actually get those materials tested with an external testing method, and then identify if similar parts had inspection methods that could not correctly identify the defect parts. This process was implemented, and the design FMEA was reviewed and updated to show that there was probably a higher probability that these could fail, and we needed additional controls to ensure this wasn't a failure. Risk was incorporated in both the CAPA process as well as updating the risk level in the design FMEA and tied back to the CAPA. The third case study we have is related to a software company. So a software medical device company started to use a CRM to classify all customer feedback. So they were getting a new product on the market. It was one of the first AI software tools. They were getting a lot of new users and wanted to implement a CRM to track this information, make sure they were properly responding to any issues. The way the CRM was set up, it had a default that any feedback they received would be classified as a complaint in the system. The system they implemented was not necessarily tied to medical device, so their definition of complaint was much different than the FDA definition of a complaint. So when we went through to do the internal audit of this company, we identified that they had over 500 complaints, but they weren't properly doing investigation. They weren't following their procedure for complaints because they were captured in the CRM and not necessarily all actual complaints. A lot of them were feedback or questions but the CRM bucket just bucketed them as complaints. The risk of the CAPA was high because if there were actual complaints or potential adverse events that hadn't been captured or investigated, it could be an issue on the product side. It could also be an issue on the compliance side, that they had a lot of these complaints without proper investigation. So the CAPA process involved reviewing all the complaints as part of the correction and seeing if there were any complaints that were actual complaints, updating the definition in the CRM, and doing a better job of separating customer questions, return information, and complaints and adverse events, rather than just having them all in the complaint bucket. And then also training the team on the appropriate processes for complaint investigation and triage of this information. A risk was used to evaluate the complaints for any reportable events. And then as part of the correction, we reviewed other software tools to see if they had any overlap with the quality system records and any other requirements for FDA compliance. This CAPA allowed this entire process to overhaul and have all the data around what needs to be done within the scope of this bigger issue. Yeah, thanks, Caroline. So the issue was that they weren't doing investigations, but they were making them as a complaint. That's why there was an issue. All right, so now we have some polling questions. I think, Etienne, that's on you, right?
Yes, let's see here. If I can get us back on screen. Hold on just a second. There we are. I may have to open a CAPA on my process for delineating questions from chat and Q&A. So thank you everybody for your patience with me in figuring that out. So there was a lot of good information shared in the chat, in the Q&A. I do have a couple polls we want to ask. So we're just going to do this before we open the Q&A to ask those questions to Kyle. This is the first one that we want to ask, and that is, if the FDA came knocking at your door tomorrow, how confident would you be in your audit readiness? So we'll just give this like 15 or 20 seconds. I'm going to start my timer so I don't go too long. We have some confident people out there. Great, that's good. Hopeful. That's probably what I would say.
I like that's an option. I like hopeful as an option.
Right. Okay, these are kind of, yeah, very good. Okay, so let's check it. We have 3, so this won't take very long, but we're just curious. How are you currently managing your documentation? Do you use a paper-based QMS, SharePoint, Google Drive, Dropbox, or general purpose QMS, or something purpose-built? And it's okay if you can't answer the poll question, no worries.
Good, lots of feedback. I like it.
Yeah. We've had an active chat group. This is really awesome.
Yeah.
I really appreciate all the engagement. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. Interesting. All right, that's good. The next one, when do you anticipate a new product launch? If this would be the next 6 months, up to 3 years, and it's interesting. We can be in a situation where we think we're going to launch next year, but if we're realistic, it might be 3 years from now. So, but what do you really think here? I'd love to see what your answers are. We'll close this kind of when we get a bit of a quorum. All right. Very cool. And maybe we can share those in the follow-up email if you're curious who you were sitting in the audience with and what their experience is. So we got a lot of questions in the Q&A. One of the questions was from, let me see, switch over here, is from Priyanka, if I'm saying your name correctly. Is correction only CAPA acceptable by FDA if it's minor and low risk? Correction only, I suppose that would be, well, I'll let you answer. What are your thoughts there?
I think you would still want to go through the corrective actions just to evaluate if there's any other open areas. It might be acceptable, but I would still go through the process of just documenting any other corrective actions to see if that was okay. But already going ahead and saying it's a minor and a low risk will help with that, but just documenting your rationale in there would be good. I would still lean on doing some corrective actions just to be safe.
Yeah, it kind of speaks a little bit to the question of your process prior to opening a CAPA. I know you kind of mentioned that early on. I don't know if you want to touch on that, on what makes sense. Not every NC becomes a CAPA, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's having a good definition in your quality system that every NC does not require a CAPA. Lean on the NC process first. So in this case, it might be better to use an NCR rather than a CAPA to start, and then see if you need a CAPA. So that would be the answer, right? If it doesn't need corrective, it might be a nonconformance, not actually a CAPA. Good point.
And so there was a lot of questions about the definition. So I pulled out my ISO 9000 just to make sure that I was, on the same page with everybody. But Christopher asked the question, would it be correct to assume that correction equals immediate action, corrective action equals addresses the root cause, preventive actions prevent the issue from ever happening again?
I think both corrective and preventive action address the root cause, correction being that it was in response to something that happened, right? In response to a complaint or nonconformance. Whereas preventive action doesn't necessarily need to be triggered by any complaint or nonconformance. It can be a potential complaint or nonconformance if something happened, right? So preventive actions can be opened without any trigger, whereas corrective actions typically have a trigger. Correction is the immediate action to correct whatever it was, right? So if you had a nonconformance related to your procedure, you would update the procedure to be compliant. That's your correction. Then you would also want to go look at other similar procedures that might have referenced the wrong standard and update those as well as part of your corrective action.
Right, let's see here. So let's move on to the next question. Do you always provide statistical methodology for your VOE if it's not really, if it's not product or manufacturing related or not really applicable? What's the best approach?
Yeah, I think if it's not manufacturing related, you can do an internal audit. That's what we like to do, is just a focused audit on that area and then have that record as the effectiveness. So if it's more like, hey, we need to ensure that the training was done and these processes are now being followed, and it's not necessarily we're going to get a lot of data out of it, then you can do an internal audit or focused audit specifically on that area and use that audit record as your verification of effectiveness.
Okay. Very cool.
Again, independent person, not involved with the process though.
Okay. Next question comes from Rayanne, if I'm saying your name correctly, and a CAPA active action plan. Wow, I can't read today. What's the difference between evaluation and validation prior to implementation and evaluation of effectiveness, and how should each be properly conducted?
So the first one, implementation, is just identifying what's going on and how you're going to fix it, whether that's updating a process, updating a procedure, updating training. And then the effectiveness check is that last step to show that what we implemented actually fixed and addressed the root cause. Wording, yeah, could be tweaked a little bit, but that's how I see the process.
Yeah. Okay. This question comes from Nirav. Let's see here. It's kind of goes back to what we were talking about with escalation. Let's say you don't have a strong risk analysis documentation with risks adequately captured. What's a practical approach to do the CAPA risk evaluation for a decision to escalate to CAPA, and to deciding on the level of CAPA risk to determine how to prioritize and what level of investigation corrective actions you need?
So I think we typically define the risk level of CAPAs in the SOP. So a high risk CAPA would be tied to patient safety or device safety or major compliance risk, right? So like if this was to be an issue in an audit, it would be a major finding, that would be a higher risk CAPA, right? Whether if this issue was identified in audit or identified with a product, it would not have any patient safety risk, it would not have any compliance risk. So defining those, so if you're early stage in your device risk analysis, you can still define these categories in your SOP and then use those in the CAPA evaluation.
There was a question about an RPN matrix in the CAPA record. Do you have any thoughts on the risk? I know you kind of talked about that a little bit in your presentation, but do you have a preference on some of these different ways of delineating risk?
Yeah, you can. I think I mentioned that. I didn't call out RPN matrix, but yeah, you can definitely use RPN matrix in your CAPA record. We've seen companies create a specific like RPN table for CAPA analysis. Definitely capable, or that's a successful method for doing risk estimation for CAPA. Just make sure you have that RPN table defined in your procedure.
There were Obiora asked a little bit more detail. How do you define methods for your effectiveness checks? I wonder if you could kind of speak to, I don't know if you have any suggestions.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about kind of the audit focus, but I think if it's more of a manufacturing or design change, then you want to go back and review data, right? So if you updated a process in your manufacturing because you're having a higher failure rate, you want to give yourself some time to collect more data and then go back and analyze, did we reduce our failure rate or is it still the same? So just collecting that data. Same with design changes. So potentially you had a complaint, you're updating a design, and you need to go back and see if this is still an issue with this type of use case or type of patient. You would go back and analyze that information, whether that's post-market, you could do a proactive clinical trial, especially if you're in Europe. Those types of things could be used to collect the data needed to show the effectiveness verification check is complete.
Okay. There was a question I liked from Gloria that I wanted to kind of go over to, and I'll just stop for a second and say, if you have any, if you want to, those of you listening, if you want to go check out the Q&A and ask some more questions or upvote the questions that have been asked, feel free to go do that. But Gloria asked, what's the recommended root cause analysis method for CAPAs? Do you have any suggestions or thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the type of CAPA, right? So 5 whys is what we typically use for like compliance procedural risk. I think it's the easiest to capture and aligns with what auditors like to see. I think for more manufacturing stuff, I think fault tree analysis is used a lot in software. So I think that's probably the most common one for software, whether that's defects, bug issues, things like that. And then like the fishbone diagram, I think is more related to complex design or manufacturing issues when there's multiple variables, right? And that one goes in a lot of different ways and lots of meetings, lots of things that could happen, but it helps you kind of identify which ones are potential causes and which ones don't apply.
Yeah, if we talk sometimes about how CAPA is one of the top 3 reasons for 483s issued by the FDA. And I think if you were to do a root cause analysis on that and open a CAPA on the CAPA issue, I think a misunderstanding of root cause analysis is the root cause. And so it's a really valuable conversation.
Root cause analysis and effectiveness verification, I think. And then just leaving them open forever is the other issue that was mentioned in the chat as well. Is that they just don't close them, and then you've got 20 open CAPAs and no updates in your CAPA record as to why. So
Mandana, if I'm saying the name correctly, actually asked that question, how long can you keep the CAPA open? They also asked, how long can you keep the verification of effectiveness open? Do you want to speak to your practical thoughts there?
I don't think there's a set answer. I think it needs to be updated when you're going through the process. If you had originally planned that we're going to do effectiveness check after 3 months, and then you went to do it, you didn't have enough data, you have 5 data points, it's not enough information. So you update your record, say, we're going to extend it 3 months. Same if you thought you were going to implement a design change and you couldn't, then you need to update the CAPA with that information.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I know there's a few other questions here. Most of these have been answered, I think. I'm trying to kind of sort through the answers versus the questions. Let's see. One of the questions from Rashid, this is an interesting question. If you have low volumes and very few opportunities for CAPA, is it okay to have no CAPAs, or should you create some to satisfy the auditor?
I think it's better to have some records. Honestly, so looking at your procedures, looking at any issues with compliance or updates to standards, you can open preventive actions. I wouldn't feel comfortable going through an audit with no CAPA records. So in some ways you have to be creative, but ongoing, I think it's okay to have low volumes and low amounts of CAPAs, but you would need to have some sort of record. Also, similar like a mock recall, you can do a mock CAPA just to show you know how to do the process. But I think it is better to have at least 1 or 2 records when you're going through an audit.
Okay. Gloria asked, she says, I'm not clear how the GG, so I'm a little selfishly, I'm just going to put this one out there, and maybe we need to get together and talk a little bit more about that one-on-one, but how the Greenlight Guru CAPA module is integrated with risk management. I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that, or feel free to punt. We can maybe take it offline.
Yeah, I mean, similar, you're able to link risk files as well as risk items in Greenlight and link those back into your CAPA. So different sources and controls of your CAPA can be linked in Greenlight. So that's the big advantage of Greenlight, is able to link anything, right? So whether that's a risk management file, any of those things can be linked back to your CAPA, and that's the process.
Yeah, and Gloria, feel free to reach out if you have additional questions. We can always talk through or show you how that works. Let's see here. We'll make this the last question. It's a little bit of a doozy. Vihita, if I'm saying the name correctly, do you need to have separate CAPA records? Is it possible to record a CAPA within the nonconformance records, because many of the requirements like root cause analysis overlaps with nonconformances? Once you identify a need for CAPA, then a change request is open, kind of describing a process here. So CAPA record is divided between the NC record and the corrective action record. Does this setup align with what you could see QSIT looking at? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just kind of high level, you would start with nonconformance. If you identify that the nonconformance has more issues and needs more investigation than your typical nonconformance record, then you would open a CAPA. It's okay to say, we're closing this nonconformance and still investigating and moving forward with this issue just now in CAPA record XYZ, right? So it's okay to close that NCR and then reference the CAPA as the new record that is addressing this and any other broader issues that are tied to that NC. I think that's kind of what she's getting at, is how do you piece these together when there's multiple open records. That's the advantage of a CAPA, right? Is to pull it all together in a CAPA and do the more thorough investigation, verification check, all that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Those of you listening, I don't know if you've ever talked for an hour like Kyle just did. It's actually a lot of work. And so I appreciate you coming on, sharing your knowledge. And those of you in the chat, thank you so much for all of you for sharing your knowledge as well. It's really great to see that. Apologies if I had removed questions from Q&A. It's not my intention to actually remove any information. It's just for filtering purposes for my own selfish interest. So please continue to share that information. We love having all of you in the audience. Thank you so much for all of this. As a reminder, we will be sending out today's recording and presentation slides, but on behalf of Greenlight Guru, I want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. Take care.